All right, so warm welcome back for everybody. I think it's quite timely that after lunch we shift gears a little bit to move from food safety and regulation to talk more about alternative proteins, but from a nutritional perspective. So as introduced, my name is Darryl. I'm representing the Singapore Institute of Food and Biotechnology Innovation. And for my presentation today, we'll be asking this very interesting question of whether or not our alternative proteins today nutritious and healthy by citing evidence from the studies that we have conducted in research done in Singapore. So these are the contents of my presentation. I'll give a bit of a background first, and then explore the three different methodologies that we have used to examine nutrition of these foods before drawing some overarching conclusions from the work that we have done. And what I really want to start off with is a brief timeline in terms of alternative proteins. And why this is important is because I would like to highlight that when it comes to alternative proteins, this is in fact not a new narrative, but rather one that has a long history. So we can see that as early as 900 BC to 600 AD, people in India, China, for example, have already been consuming these foods, although largely driven by religion and philosophy. So I think some of us will be familiar with foods like seitan or wheat gluten or soy-based tofu as well. And over the years, we see that there's a gradual transition from religion, philosophy to compassion as one of the key motivators. A prominent landmark would be the formation of the Vegetarian Society in the UK, 1847, and its emphasis on health and nutrition really came a bit later with the advent of the veggie burger. I think some of us will be familiar with the product. This was before I was born. But what we see today are, in fact, a novel class of plant-based alternative proteins. And I think a lot of what we notice is also its emphasis in terms of sustainability and what we learned this morning on food safety as well. But this kind of also brings us some interesting opportunities, and that is the fact that these novel plant-based alternative foods are kind of designed to mimic the meat-like organoleptic attributes to help promote a dietary transition. So I think for many of us here who are habitual omnivores, it would help us to nudge that shift toward more plant-based or even flexitarian diets. But yet, from what we understand today, information on health and how it impacts our well-being, nutritional status remains underexplored. So in the paper that my group published a couple of years ago, we just discussed about that, and that is how there are unknown impacts when it comes to the plant-based meat alternatives that we know today. And this is very important because many of us who are familiar with traditional plant-based foods recognize plant-based as products such as your legumes, your nuts, your seeds. But at the same time, it gives consumers a false impression when it comes to novel plant-based foods. Because being described as plant-based, it may give sort of a health halo that these foods may be just as healthy, which is not necessarily the case. Because if we really scrutinize some of these products, it can be somewhat described as a deconstruction and reassembly of ingredients. And what do I mean by that? So we take food like soybeans, we obtain soy protein isolate. Cassava, we have cassava flour. Coconut, we have coconut oil. And then by combining it with a judicious mix of preservatives, emulsifiers, stabilizers, we then process it into products that yield meat-like fibers and meat-like mince. A key problem that is often understated is that as a part of this process, much of the important micronutrients and phytochemicals that are responsible for the health-promoting properties of these plant-based foods are actually lost as part of the process. Of course, many of the products we see today are often also fortified at a later step, and therefore this warrants the need for further investigation. So this is a paper we published earlier this year, and of course, a simple way to look at the nutritional composition is simply by analytical methods. So in this study that we published, we obtained 20 commonly consumed animal-based meats in Singapore and found 20 corresponding plant-based meat analogs, which can be purchased from either the supermarket or from fast food joints, and just did a simple analytical comparison. And I think much to our surprise, what we noticed was that if we do a side-to-side comparison, you can see green being plant-based, red being animal-based, is that In almost every single mineral, we see significantly higher levels in the plant-based as compared to the conventional animal-based foods. Of course, for a majority of these instances, this would be regarded as favorable. For example, if you look at magnesium, calcium, because it helps the population to meet their dietary requirements. Of course, one caveat to that would be specific to sodium, which is about 50% higher. And of course, why we see this, it could be due to various reasons. For example, as I mentioned, the use of fortifications to ensure that they reach the nutritional requirements of the food it is intended to substitute. The use of various preservative texturants, such as calcium chloride, in addition to its functional properties, also contribute to calcium, for example, in a food product. And we learned a bit about soy lake hemoglobin in terms of colorings and flavorings. And likewise, this also increases the level of iron in some of these foods. But for a nutrition scientist like myself, this only forms a part of the picture. And why this is so is because we don't eat foods, we eat diets. So if we are introducing these foods into our meals, what exactly is it substituting? Are people preparing their meals differently because of this shift? So what is the influence on broader diet? Secondly, what are the differences when it comes to nutritional physiology? Now, this is important because there are differences in terms of the food structure, the food matrix, and also the chemical form in which these nutrients are being delivered. And therefore, there may be differences in terms of how readily available these nutrients are when we are talking about these new food products. And lastly, what is its impact on health and chronic disease risk? Now, this really takes a different slant because we're looking at it in terms of a longer-term dietary substitution. If we want to introduce these new foods into the diets of people, how exactly will this have an impact in terms of health? And how can we manage it at an earlier stage to ensure that we are able to promote health as much as possible? And so one of the studies that we have did was a dietary modeling study. And this is a very simple approach which makes use of a very common technique used in many nutritional studies, and that is basically to simulate the nutritional effects of replacing foods with something that is new. And what we have done is using food records that we obtained from a community in Singapore. We identified approximately 600 various meal events, and we classified these foods based on the food groups that it represents. So it can be a staple food, it can be a fruit, vegetable, or protein-rich food. And for every single animal-based rich food product, we did a one-to-one substitution with a corresponding plant-based meat alternative. And basically after that, we then did a nutritional profile comparison. And what these plots actually show are the density distribution when it comes to the various nutrients such as protein. So what you can see here, the red representing animal-based and the blue representing alternative proteins, is that with a shift or a substitution, we are actually consuming less amounts of protein if we do a gram-to-gram change. Now, for most of us in our audience here today, this may not be a big issue, but for older adults, for example, which may have dietary protein requirements that are 20%, 30% higher, this may have a considerable impact in terms of various age-related diseases. And in terms of other types of macronutrients, we see that total fat, saturated fat are reduced, but at the same time, monounsaturated fat is also reduced with the substitution. Dietary fiber is increased, and when it comes to various different micronutrients, the trends we see are also quite different in the sense that there are benefits in terms of an increase in calcium intake, but at the same time, we are also risking potentially overexposure to sodium, which was also a topic brought up in the discussions yesterday. And so some key conclusions from this paper, it kind of suggests that with the switch, it may potentially actually aid some segments of the population to better meet the daily nutritional requirements, but yet at the same time, it can introduce certain unintended consequences when it comes to protein intake, when it comes to sodium as well, and this could put specific strata of the population at greater risk for certain diseases. To some extent, what we understand is also kind of limited in terms of the commonly identified macro and micronutrients, and what is often underrepresented are also various bioactives and phytochemicals that are commonly associated with the plant-based foods that we conventionally consume. And so the ideal way to really examine this is through a context of a randomized controlled dietary intervention. And we've done just that, and the results published just earlier this year in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Essentially, what we have done was to recruit about 89 men and women, and we wanted to examine the impact of omnivorous plant-based meat alternative diets versus animal-based meat diets on various related outcomes. The primarily one being cardiometabolic health, but also looking at it from a biological micronutrient status perspective, and also through changes in the metabolome if you really wanted to elucidate some underlying mechanisms. So the population was middle-aged and older. They had raised blood glucose, non-obese, but at the baseline, they were consuming roughly approximately equal amounts of animal and plant-based proteins. And of course, we randomized them into these two groups. So what did we feed them with? So it was really a range of various animal-based and plant-based foods, including nuggets, pork mince, chicken fillet, patty, beef mince, sausages. And for the plant-based meat alternatives, we obtained it from brands that were commercially available. So for example, the Vegetarian Butcher, Omni, Beyond Impossible, which I think most of us in the audience are familiar with. And so to examine it, the first part of the study, we looked at it from an acute perspective. And a simple way to do so is with a continuous glucose monitor. So for those of us who are not familiar, essentially it is a device that is being attached to the arm, and it provides us with glucose readings every 5 to 15 minutes. And during this period of time, we actually task our participants to follow every single food that we are providing them. So essentially, the two groups are consuming identical diets that are differentiated only by the source of protein, which is also protein quantity match. And this is basically the changes in interstitial glucose that we observe. So once again, the green for plant-based, the red for animal-based, and we can quite clearly see that there's a distinct characteristics in terms of the trends, whereby in every single meal, from breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, the plant-based meats actually showed a distinctly greater peak when it comes to glucose changes. And this may indicate potentially detrimental effects when it comes to glycemic regulation. And when we look at it in terms of more holistically, we notice that several indices, such as the management of glucose within a specific time and range, as well as GRADE, which is basically an index that classifies hypo and hyperglycemic events, we notice that this can potentially be deteriorated with plant-based ingredients. But yet, there still remains opportunity, of course, we recognize in the product, with potential of careful reformulation, for example, with the use of higher quality carbohydrates, lower glycemic index carbohydrates, to be able to manage potentially detrimental effects when it comes to glycemic management. And for the remainder of the study, which is an 8-week period, essentially we asked our participants to substitute the protein-rich foods that they consumed habitually whilst maintaining all other components of the diet, such as their staple foods, fruits, and vegetables. So there's a bit of freedom, but to some extent we allow this freedom because we want to understand how exactly these foods are being incorporated into the diets of the people, because this is ultimately very important as opposed to a very strictly controlled setting. And to share some of the findings from a recent publication, firstly, as you can see, these are some of the delicacies that we have in Singapore. And I think being the first study to actually examine plant-based meats in Singapore, it is also quite interesting to see how a food like a burger patty, maybe it is consumed quite conventionally in the West, for example, is consumed in forms such as in soup in Singapore as well. So there can be quite distinct cultural differences in how we consume our foods. So in terms of what we observe in terms of nutrient intake, we did notice that there are favorable effects when it comes to a shift to plant-based meats with reductions in trans fat, cholesterol, which is expected, as well as an increase in dietary fiber. Micronutrients such as B6, folate, potassium, calcium, and iron are also increased, but sodium, as we have talked about earlier, remains to be a problem. But for this paper, we actually took it a step further by looking at the differences in terms of biological status. Basically, by measuring biomarkers in the blood, they may be quantitative of the amount of nutrients that we are consuming. So in this study, we noticed that in both groups, the participants were actually consuming quite similar levels of vitamin B12 as a consequence of the fortification. However, what is also interesting to see was that the biological status was actually significantly improved in the plant-based groups, which to some extent suggests that there are differences in bioavailability when we are consuming B12 in a supplemental form as opposed to a natural food form as well. However, this was not the same across all the various different types of nutrients. If we look at calcium, we did notice that participants in the plant-based meat groups are actually consuming almost twice as much calcium. However, when we look at biological status markers, including the bone mineral density, as well as various outcomes that are relevant to bone turnover, biological status for calcium was actually better retained in the animal-based groups, which is quite interesting for us. So to some extent, it kind of suggests that what we see in the nutrition information panel must be validated to some extent in terms of its bioavailability and ultimately even the function that said nutrient is supposed to elicit after consumption. And this should be, in my opinion, something we need to consider. And lastly, we also looked at it in terms of health. So we talked about its impact on glycemic management. So I'll also be paying attention to what we observe in terms of cardiovascular health, especially since we noticed that there is an increase in terms of sodium intake. So what does it actually mean? So in our study, what was done was actually, in addition to clinic blood pressure measurements, we equipped our participants with an ambulatory blood pressure measurement. Essentially, this measures blood pressure every 15 to 60 minutes, both when they are awake and also when they are asleep. And one of the important characteristics that we are observing is what we call the nocturnal blood pressure dip. Essentially, for individuals with a healthy vasculature, we're expecting a dip of about 10 to 20%, so a decrease in blood pressure when we are asleep. However, potentially because of the added amounts of sodium and how much this is retained after longer-term consumption, we also noticed that blood pressure management, particularly the nocturnal dip, was actually worsened in the plant-based alternatives group. So therefore, this also brings us potential opportunities in terms of what we can do in terms of reducing the amount of sodium whilst optimizing the intensity of saltiness that we are perceiving, or potentially even through flavor optimization methods. So to wrap up my presentation today, what we have learned from the current generation of plant-based alternatives to some extent suggests that they have been carefully designed to be able to optimize nutrition to a good extent. But yet what we see from the products today is still different and distinct from what we conventionally recognize as plant-based diets, which are a lot more well-established. I've also highlighted the potential of looking at bioavailability and actual functionality of the nutrients rather than just looking at it from a nutrition information panel perspective. And in terms of cardiometabolic health, which was something that we looked at in greater detail, there are also potential in terms of how we can reconsider how these foods are being developed, being mindful of its impact in terms of glycemic regulation, as well as sodium refinement. And for a take-home message, nutrition, in my opinion, must be considered alongside the current focus of sustainability and organoleptic attributes in order for us to evolve the next generation of healthier alternative protein foods. Of course, what I shared with you here is more or less the framework, because we talked a lot about precision fermentation, cell culture meats. So essentially, a similar strategy can be adopted in order to evaluate the health implications of these foods, especially before we implement it to the wider population. So to also acknowledge some of the collaborators and sponsors for the research that I presented earlier. So thank you all for your attention.